Hello and welcome to today's Twinmotion webinar, where we're going to look at how we can work with some custom asset libraries. More specifically, how we can work with importing and working with external assets, assets that you may create yourself or maybe they're from a third-party vendor. So let's begin. The first thing that we're going to take a look at here is essentially what we're going to learn, and we'll take a quick peek at what my agenda is here today as to what we want to cover. So overall, Twinmotion and custom asset libraries. We're going to look at how we can work with anything that you want to be able to bring into your projects in Twinmotion. And we'll look at a couple tips and tricks on the way. So in this webinar overall, you're going to learn how to work with assets from outside, something that you've created, or perhaps from a third-party company or a third-party library for that matter. We're going to look at what file formats are supported. We'll look at some preferred file formats with assets and with textures. We'll look at how to properly import and create custom user libraries in Twinmotion. So how to bring assets in, how to create those user libraries, and how to reuse them in other projects there as well. And of course, as I mentioned, some tips and tricks for working with models and materials in Twinmotion. So just before we jump into everything here, a quick agenda as to what we're going to look at here. So more specifically as to what we're going to look at an overview of some of the asset requirements, or the requirements that we need to kind of adhere to when we bring in models for real-time environments, right? And the same thing applies for different things like textures as well. We'll look at some tips on exporting assets, some preferred settings. We'll look at third-party assets as well, a couple of examples in there, creating user libraries as mentioned, and some of these tips and tricks in Twinmotion that we'll take a look at that can help your workflows overall. So before we really dive in deep, we have a lot of different people from all different industries joining us in this webinar today, which is amazing. And just very quickly, for those that aren't completely familiar with Twinmotion, what is Twinmotion? Well, it's a visualization tool. It's very powerful, really quick and easy to use. The idea behind Twinmotion is to get you to create beautiful imagery, whether it be outputting things like video or super high quality images, even virtual reality projects, pano environments, so panoramic imagery, or even a standalone type of application in there. Twinmotion is dedicated towards professionals in different industries. So for example, architecture, engineering, construction, urban planning, and landscaping as well. The philosophy behind Twinmotion is, as I mentioned, to get things in there really quickly, to get you working really quickly. So the idea is to remove the complexity, right? To keep it as simple as possible so that you're creating your visual workflow as quickly as you need to be able to create it. So we want you to be able to really rapidly bring to life any architectural project. And the nice thing about Twinmotion, as you'll see as we're working here, has a very small learning curve. It's really quick and easy to jump into and pick up a lot of the things that I'm going to show you here today. So who's Twinmotion for? Well, it is for kind of these two different areas, this non-technical world. So people that just want to quickly produce compelling content, that is, bring a bunch of assets in, throw some lighting scenarios or a different theme or whatever it may be, and output beautiful imagery or video, whatever it is that you want to accomplish. Or someone that wants to dive in and maybe get a little more technical. Something that's going to bring in, someone that's going to bring in assets and create really quick prototypes. Developing different things like weather studies or different thematic or mood studies, or working with custom paths for vehicles or characters, whatever it may be. So, the nice thing about Twinmotion is it can kind of cater to a variety of people's experience within the 3D world. So let's jump in now. So importing and working with external assets in Twinmotion. So again, some of these slides are just very quick, very brief here as to what we're looking for when we're working with assets in Twinmotion. So the first thing I want to mention is that the hardware configuration for the user is an important consideration when building a project in any real-time environment. So obviously with the higher end hardware configuration, for example, a super high-end GPU, enough RAM, really fast, adequate storage, for example, solid state, something that's quick read and write, and of course CPUs as well, to be able to produce really high-end imagery or video, or for that matter, to be able to handle more data. And that really is the key here, which goes into the next point, is we do want to consider that regardless of your hardware consideration or configuration, we want to consider what the overall budget is, the constraints that we're working with, or for that matter, what we're working with to keep it running smooth. At the bottom here, I have this real-time requirements for assets. So in the end, we want efficiency. We want performance. We want everything to be performant. So we want things to not be overly dense, and we want to make sure that we keep our assets looking nice, but we don't need them to be super high resolution. This is kind of the old school trick that still is very much so applicable today with real-time performance on anything. We want assets to look high res, but actually be more lower resolution. And there's lots of things that you can do with textures and materials to make lower res assets look like the way they were maybe in a higher res format. And this is really important. We don't want to start populating any kind of real-time environment with really dense polygonal structures, right? Geometry that's super dense, lots of polygons or triangles going on in there. Really ultra high resolution textures. These are things that will bog down performance. So we kind of want to dial in how we're working with these assets. As we can see, and we're going to see, Twinmotion can work with many different file formats. So whether it be things like FBX or SketchUp Pro, and then into our texture directory there, many different file formats in there as well. What we're going to do is look at some of the preferred settings, or for that matter, preferred formats for that, to make sure that everything is running efficient and, as I mentioned, performant. So exporting assets, we're going to look at really quickly here. I'm going to use actually Maya as an example. This doesn't matter. I'm keeping this generic. The idea is really the same in the end. So everything that I'm using in here, it's either come natively from a third-party company. We're going to look at some of these different asset libraries here, a few examples here in a moment. I'm using FBX, and I'd recommend you stick with FBX for assets coming from, maybe unknown sources that you've been sharing with a colleague, or they're coming from third-party asset libraries. FBX is really a go-to format that will allow you to bring it in quickly into Twinmotion, and quite often you can bring all your textures loaded in and set up with it. And we'll look at how we can work with that as well. So textures can come in a variety of different formats. Typically, the better quality and resolution and overall formats to work with are things like PNG, TIFF, and Targa. And the reason is that they can handle very high resolution, really good quality. They're uncompressed, and they can compress well within a real-time environment, but they also can support alpha channels. So if we have things like, maybe leaves on a tree that we need an alpha channel for, we can simply provide that in a number of different ways, but these formats can help there as well. Now, that's not to say that you cannot use things like JPEG or other formats like DDS. By all means, you can use those formats. I'm just simply pointing out some of the preferred things here. The nice thing about things like PNG, TIFF, and Targa, you can preserve the high resolution, high quality of them, working with things like an image editor, for example, like Photoshop, where you can down-res to the resolution you may require. So, for example, working with something bigger like an 8K texture map, it's often preferred to work with that a little smaller, maybe something like 2K. Will be more than enough depending on what your project requirements are. And that's the key as well here, is everyone's project requirements are different. The example data set we're going to use is a bit of a bigger neighborhood environment, so we can get away with maybe some lower textures in the background on different buildings or some of the props or vehicles that are moving around. But if we're in an interior environment, and maybe that's what we're using Twinmotion for, is just something on an interior, we may want to push those assets up a little bit or those textures up a little bit, depending on how close they get to our viewer camera. So we'll look at some of these export options, and I actually have a couple of grabs here. And again, I'm using just Maya as a quick example. So on the left here, Maya exporting FBX. Now, it doesn't matter what product it is that you're using as your 3D content creation package, or a package that you're using to augment or change an asset. Again, I'm using Maya in here, but this could be 3ds Max, Cinema 4D, Blender. It could be whatever other package you may want to work with that can handle an FBX export. A couple of things that I typically will go to and use in there are things like the embed media button there. You can see that that box is not checked. When I'm working with assets coming from another source, I'll typically check that box so that I can get my asset coming over and bringing the textures in there with me. Some things that we want to be aware of on both sides here, you can see on the right-hand side, that's the Twinmotion importer. We want to be aware of the up axis that we're working with. Now, Maya works with a Y up axis, so we want to be aware of how that asset is sitting or living in that world. And it's not a problem if it's exported in whatever access from whatever package. We can always import or tell Twinmotion to handle that access in a different format. So in the example on the right here, the default setting is a Z or Z up access in there. So third-party assets. Many libraries are available, and as you can see here is some examples. Working with TurboSquid for some props, getting into Access for a great character library, Xfrog for an excellent library of trees and plants. We're going to look at some examples there, and of course Quixel with the Megascan library, some amazing textures and other assets in there we'll take a look at as well. So the important thing to do here is if you really want to dive into how assets are constructed, we're certainly not going to go into the nitty-gritty of modeling assets or creating assets from scratch here. That's a whole other discussion. If you want to look at that, there are many different tutorials and courses on learning how to build lower resolution assets or low poly assets that represent something much more higher resolution, and how you can work with textures, many different texture channels to provide that imagery or that asset that looks like it's much more higher res than it is, so that you get that performance that you require and the quality you require for your scene. And a good way to do that, if you want to learn as well, is to grab assets from these other places and open them up in another package and take a note of the way they're constructed. Things like the polygonal count, the overall resolution of the textures, how things are constructed or put together for that asset. You can always take an asset from somewhere else and augment or add to in other packages as well, and then simply export it out into a format, something like FBX, like I mentioned, to be able to bring it over to Twinmotion. You can also use other packages for format conversion. So just because I'm mentioning some of these different formats that Twinmotion natively will bring in doesn't mean that you're trapped and you can't bring in assets from other places that are different formats. If you have the ability to take an asset from any package in any format and export it into something like an FBX or even an OBJ, whatever it may be, you have the ability to convert that asset if you want to bring it into Twinmotion. So there are a number of ways to work with those as well. So direct link plugins, this is really important to point out. When working with Twinmotion, the access to all these different pieces of geometry out there aren't just limited to the amazing sample library that comes with Twinmotion or what we're going to show on how we can bring outside assets into Twinmotion. You also have access to things through our direct link plugins. And as you can see, we have support for ArchiCAD, for Revit, SketchUp Pro, and RicCAD, and we're always looking at adding more into there as well. And what this allows you to do is simply work in a format from your package and be able to use the Twinmotion direct link. The plugins are free, you download them, install them, take your assets and your data, and you can send it right over to Twinmotion. So this is another source for bringing assets into Twinmotion. This is another way that you could have assets in those other formats from a CAD world, from whatever it may be, and be able to bring them from those packages directly into Twinmotion as well. The materials will utilize Twinmotion materials. You can utilize your original materials as they come over, but we recommend you use Twinmotion materials because they are built to be handled in a very physically accurate, a PBR rendering, if you will, physically based rendering within the Twinmotion real-time environment. So the Twinmotion Direct Link plugins are available on the website, the Unreal Engine website. The easiest way to get to that is simply you can type in Twinmotion Direct Link plugins into something like into Google, or even go to twinmotion.com, which will take you to Unreal Engine, and you can go down the Twinmotion page and you'll find these direct link plugins here as well. Okay, so we're going to jump over to Twinmotion. And very quickly, here is an empty default Twinmotion scene. We get this default background. I'm just going to tumble around here. You can see that we have a really simple environment, but I don't have anything else going on in here. Just a quick overview. On the right is my scene graph. This is kind of like my object list, my outliner, if you will, of my, where my hierarchy will live, of all my different assets that we're going to work with and bring in here. On the left here, I have this other little arrow. If I click that, this accesses the Twinmotion library. Everything from materials, vegetation and landscape, different furniture pieces. We can see that there is a really nice library of things in here that are built to function beautifully within the Twinmotion environment. So if you get a chance, dive in and take a look at the free library that comes with Twinmotion. It's pretty amazing. What we're going to take a look at today, though, is utilizing other assets from other sources. So specifically, this user library area right here. If I click on that right now, we can see that there's nothing in there. So that's not a problem. We're going to look at how we can bring assets in and start to populate a custom library in there. I'm just going to move this guy out of the way for right now. And down below, I'm going to go to our different little nodes that we have down here in this workspace, this palette-based workspace. And on the little arrow box, you can see that we have all different kinds of different things here. If I click on them, they'll highlight the different parameters available there. But I want to click on this little arrow into the box, and that's import. Another way that we can do this as well is to go to File, Import, or use Control+I. You can also hover over top of these three lines in here to get to the import. So many different ways to be able to access what I'm about to do here. Right now, what I want to do is start to bring in some assets so we can look at how we work with assets in Twinmotion and how we can start to populate a custom library. So the first thing I'm going to do is hit import in here. It's going to ask me what I want to import. By default, it's geometry. You can also bring in things like landscape. We're going to work with geometry here today. It's going to ask me where my file is, and there's some options. Let's first grab the file that we want to work with. Okay, so we're in here. We're going to start to populate our scene with a couple of different things. Now we have some of those examples we mentioned, from Turbo Squid, some trees and characters and some textures. Let's start with what we have from Turbo Squid here. I have a couple things that we're going to work with in here. This is a simple little iron gate, and you can see that I have this folder called Scale Fix. And the reason why is it was way off in scale and it was in a different location. So I actually just went into Maya, placed it at the 0 origin, and scaled it back down to a real world scale. So that's important that we're actually adhering to real world scale so that everything does come in at least close to real world. Ideally, you want it to come in exactly sitting at real world scale, but you'll find when you're working with third-party libraries, they often don't. So I'm just going to hit open on this. Before I hit OK, I'm going to go into the options though. There's some important things that we need to look at in here. So for example here, collapse. Collapse by material. I'm going to take this one because it's built with a lot of different pieces and I just want to work with it as one piece. I'm actually going to click collapse all. Now this is important. There may be times that you want the entire hierarchy or you want it collapsed by a material. We're going to look at how we work with those in a couple different import examples here. The other thing is the up access. I'm going to leave it as default for right now and we can see what we work with. There are times you may bring something in from a third-party library that you may not know what the up access is. So unfortunately, you may bring that in and say, oh, that's wrong, and you may have to rotate it by hand. Or you can re-import it with the correct up access if you'd like. Let's take a look at a couple scenarios there. So I'll hit OK. And here it's going to bring it down below here. We can see in this palette, import, FBX Iron Gate. But most notably, what we want is over here in our scene graph, it's actually in our scene. So where is it in the scene? I don't see it in here. If I start to tumble around, we could probably find it. In fact, there it is right there. The best way to get to that asset in your scene is to hit F. And that's essentially going to frame in or focus on your asset that you want to work with. And there's this little gate. We're going to use that in our city scene or our street scene to do a couple of things with that. So I have this in my scene. It looks okay. It's giving me what I need, at least for some materials in there and the geometry in there. Now what we can start to do is I might bring in a couple of other assets in here around this to be able to work with in a scene. So what I'm doing here is we're going over how we import it, but then I'm going to assemble a couple of different things that I want to use in a completely different project. So we're using this kind of as our assembly place for a user library. By no means would you have to do that. You can do that in any project. But because we're working with all different types of assets here, I figured it'd be easy to start in a blank Twinmotion scene, build up a user library, and then we'll jump into a bigger project here. So we have our iron gate in, it looks fine. Let's bring in some more assets in here. So I'm actually going to hit import again. I'm going to go up a little bit into my Turbo Squid folder here. I do have a couple of things that I have. For example, this club chair, I know I want to bring in for an interior that I want to work with. I'm going to leave that as collapsed by material this time. So I'll just hit OK. And there's our club chair. It's sitting right at that gate. That's fine. It doesn't really matter the orientation. This is important though. If I had a problem with how that chair is oriented right now, I could change this. I could move this around and have it maybe facing a different direction, a different scale, or even change the materials on it. And when I place it in my user library, it will adhere to that. For now, I'm just going to leave this like this. And let's bring in one more before we start to define our user library into some different categories. So let's go into open here, and let's jump into maybe some of our axis characters here. Now we have a couple of characters that are going to come in over from Axis. I'm going to grab this. It's important to note that I'm using some of the free samples that Axis provides. Definitely check out what they have available. They have some really cool samples in here. So I'll hit open. I'm going to collapse that by, I actually am going to keep hierarchy, and we're going to see why in a moment here. And we'll leave everything as default. We'll bring that in. It's processing the data. The reason why this one's taking just a little bit longer is because it's actually bringing a character set in. So here's that character set that I was talking about here. So I'm going to turn these guys around, and I'm actually going to pull them forward. You can see I'm just using this little translator down below here to work with them. So we have 5 characters. It's actually 5 variations of the characters that come with this sample pack. And that's great. We have the choice to pick and choose what we want. Now, for me, in my user library, I'm going to leave them like that. When we work with them, we'll probably do something different here and pick specifically the character that we want to work with. So for right now, I'm going to leave those guys like that. And lastly, let's just bring in one example tree from Xfrog here. We'll go back, go to our Xfrog folder in here. We can bring in something like this European hackberry tree. So we'll bring that in. I don't think we really need to collapse this, or actually we do need to collapse it all, I should say. We don't want the entire hierarchy of everything. I'm just going to collapse the whole thing, and you'll see how this comes in here as well. We'll import that tree into here, and I'm just going to pull the tree forward here. Oh, this tree is actually laying in a different axis. So you can see here that this tree was constructed or exported in a different format here. So by using the default of Z axis up, it's bringing it on its side. Now, it's not the end of the world here. We can simply go in and change that. And the easiest way to do that is if I go down into here, pull up this arrow by statistics, and we'll go to transform. And what I want to do is actually rotate this. 90 is the opposite way. So we'll actually put negative or minus 90 there. And there's our tree coming in as we would hope or expect. Now, one thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete the tree and just redo this again, just so that we know how we can avoid that. Or in that case, if we didn't know where that asset was coming from, this is a prime example of, you know, how we could re-import this differently if we wanted to. So I'm just going to go back, pick that European hackberry, go into my options, and this time with the up axis, I'm going to change this to Y up, because I know I had to rotate that in the Y axis to get it to be Y up. So we'll leave it as that. I'm going to collapse it all, so it's just one thing. We'll take a look at what that is in the hierarchy there. I'm going to use the scene materials that Twinmotion brings. So what that's going to do is it's going to put all the textures in to a Twinmotion built material. So we'll hit OK, and there's our tree right off the bat. It looks proper. So if I go down into this, we can just drag our tree. I'm just grabbing the little ball here, which means it'll stick on top of everything. Or I can grab these areas here to bring it around. But our tree looks pretty good there. It's coming in as I would hope and expect it to be. And it's also in the proper axis, the Y-axis that I had to, apparently wherever it lived, it was built in a different axis, so we had to define it as that. Not a problem. So if we come into the European Hackberry here, this folder, you can see the difference between the other hierarchies here. Lots of pieces in the other ones. This one here is defined by material, and this one here I've just collapsed it completely. Instead of having all the components, I just have it as one. So it's very easy and portable to move around my scene. So when I start to work with this in my scene, I can easily grab it and move it around. Okay, so that's fine. We'll build up a user library here, but there's a good couple of examples to work with. Now, let's bring our left panel out on our library side, and let's start creating a user library. It's actually really easy to do. We need the objects in Twinmotion first before we can populate our own custom asset library, or for that matter, our user library. So the first thing I'm going to do is start to create some folders. I'll build a new category. In here, I'm actually going to, let's actually step up because I want to rename this. I'm going to right click and rename this. And I'm just going to call this one, we'll give it a capital here just to keep it formal. We're going to call this one trees. Now, we're going to organize all of these guys into categories in here. So here's my eurohackberry.fbx. We can see it in this folder. All of these other assets we brought in are in their own structures here within our scene graph. I'm going to right click on this one here, and I'm just going to come right down to add to user library. So this is key. This is where we're going to add that to this custom user library. Before I do that though, I want to show you where the user library lives and where you can change the path, because that's really important. Right now by default, where it lives, if I come up to edit, go to preferences or press Control P, we'll see things here like our settings, quality, and appearance. What we want to do is go to custom paths. So if I go down to that, this is where our user library folder exists. So you can see that it's set up to my documents directory here, and it lives in that documents Twinmotion 2019/user library. Well, if we were to go to that user library right now, here it is. It's actually empty, but it's just populated that with that new folder that I've created. So that's great. As we add things to it, we could go right in there into Windows and we would see it populate with these things that we're going to add. Now, I'm just going to exit out of that. Now, it's important to note we can change this library folder, which is really important because if we're working with different drives on a different part of the network or whatever we want to store our assets for a project, this is where we'd want to set that. So for this here, I'm going to just leave it as default. And this is where yours, your first time using Twinmotion, or if you haven't changed the custom path, yours will be by default to your user path directory, wherever that may live in whatever system or setup you're using. So I'm going to leave that and just hit OK. But if you want to change it, that is where you change it under Edit Preferences. So let's go back. I'm going to right click on this guy and I'm going to go Add to User Library. And we'll see that it will place this over here with a quick little thumbnail as well. Now, we have a tree folder that we've created. Let's take this eurohackberry.fbx and drag and drop it on top of that folder. If I go in the folder now, there it is. So let's start to really rapidly create our user library and categorize it here as well. So I'm going to hit the plus sign. I'm going to call something here street, because I do have some street props that we'll be working with here. Let's make a couple other folders here. Actually, we'll just hit the plus sign again, right click and rename this to characters. There we go. And then the last thing I want to do is create one in here. I'm going to name this one furniture. Whoops. Bad spelling today. There we go. Furniture. And now we have some of our folders. So we can start to go one by one. Since I've already got this tree into my user library, I'll just hide the visibility away with clicking off the eyeball. Let's go to the characters. We want to add that to our user library. So I'll just right click, go to Add to User Library. It'll take a moment to go in. Remember, this is a little bit bigger because it has a couple of different variations of our character in there. And it's also going to build out that thumbnail for us as well. And then it'll place it here at the top root in our library. So there's our characters now brought over to the user library. Again, there's our thumbnail, which is great. I'm just going to left click, drag, and drop that into our characters folder. Again, it's in that characters folder. So let's go back up to the top. We'll hide away the characters in here. And our club chair now, we'll right click, add to user library. Pops that in here. And we'll drag that onto furniture. And last but not least, we're going to take our iron gate, add to user library, and we'll drag and drop that onto our street folder in there. So we now have a couple of different folders going on that represent some of the categories we're going to work with. We could certainly sit here and populate this with more, but the cool thing about what I've just done here is we're now going to go into an actual different demo scene where we'll access this exact library because it's accessing that as my defined custom path. So I'll always be able to access that library, and we can populate it with more in that scene if we wanted to. So here we are in our demo scene, which is this really cool demo, Walton Lane, provided to us by, generously provided to us by Jonathan Reeves, an architect that has done some very cool stuff in Twinmotion. So he's graciously allowed us to use his data set here for our demo. So if you're not familiar with Twinmotion, when you first jump in, and especially if it's an open scene or a working project here, you may see some things like this. Now, what this is just like in Unreal Engine, where we have what we call our game mode, where we view things without all of the different props or different little manipulators that are within a scene. So what we're seeing here are the objects that define things like custom paths, lights, different effects, whatever it may be. If I hit the G key, it's going to hide those all away. So you may see me do that throughout here. I'll hit G back and forth perhaps. I'm going to actually just leave it on here for a moment. And we're going to start to rapidly populate this scene. Now here we are in a very large scene. You can see there's a lot of data happening in here. If I go to my scene graph, it's quite big and quite extensive here. So we have a lot of stuff happening in here. I'm just going to close up a couple of these in here, and we'll start to bring in some of our stuff from our user library. So I'm going to go to the top little left arrow. Here's our libraries again. There's our user library. Remained open from our last scene, and there's the folders that I created. Now I've added a few more things in there since then, but the first thing I want to do is start to populate some of these areas here with some things like some trees. So we might want to go in and grab some trees. The thing that's important to note around this scene here, if you're working with a new project or a project that's been shared with you, usually assume that the origin might be at the middle, but the middle of this project, for that matter, is actually over in this area because this house we're going to jump into, we're going to go into some interiors there. So we're going to start dropping objects that are going to come into around this area, and we'll just drag them over and bring them in. So let's begin by taking a look at something like putting some trees along this street. We have some here, but let's start to drag them in from our user library. So I'm going to bring in this hackberry here. So I'm going to drag this guy from the user library into perhaps an area just like that. And if I hit F and zoom in on this, I want to make sure that our tree is snapped to the ground, which it is. So that looks pretty good. Maybe we'll rotate this guy around. We're getting some good shade from that, which looks nice. To change this up, I'm going to put a different tree over on this side. So I'm going to use this horse chestnut. And you can see by dragging and dropping them in, I'm able to place that wherever I want it to be. Now that one there looks a little too big, so I'm actually going to hit scale on this guy in here. So let's go to our transform tab. I'll go down to the bottom. This is a horse chestnut tree. We'll grab that horse chestnut, and if I wanted to begin to work with scale on this or rotation or any of this in here, I can hit the tab key to cycle through that, or I could use the transform numerical values. In this case, I'm just going to grab the middle of the transform, and I'm just going to bring that down to something maybe around there, something that kind of coincides with the size of the other tree over there. And that placement I think is okay. And another thing that we can do now, if we want to rapidly populate similar trees in the area, we can drag and drop again from our user library. Or what we can do, if we want to populate the scene with these same trees, we can actually drag and drop them again from the user library, or we could create an instance or a copy of them. And I'm going to do that in this case here. So I'm just going to hold down my shift key and go over top of one of these little directions here. I'm going to use this direction here. So by holding down shift, left mouse clicking this, you can see that I actually get a second version of that tree. It's going to ask me, do I want that to be a direct copy, which is going to be a separate piece of geometry, an instance of that tree, meaning that anything I do to that tree is going to happen to the instance. An instance is fine for what I'm doing here. So I'm just going to rotate this guy around so he looks a little bit different. And before I get into fitting him exactly where he wants to go, actually that's not too bad there. We can do that with the other tree here as well. So I can select that, hold down Shift, and just quickly bring that. We'll make it an instance. And we'll just place it over in that area. There we go, that's fine. And actually what we may want to do is scale this guy. Maybe he's a little bit different. We could even rotate it to be a little bit different there as well. And now we have some trees quickly populated in our scene. So let's continue working with this scene here. We can see that I wanted to bring in that iron gate that we worked with in here. So we're going to place a gate right here at the front of this driveway. But we have some little fence pieces here that we'll probably have to remove. Let's find out. We're going to go into our user library. We'll go into our street folder. There's our iron gate. So I'm just going to drag that guy right into here. We can see that our scene is a little bit off in rotation. Not a problem. I can come in here and rotate this guy right around. A note on that here, if I want to have control over how I'm working with things in snapping, I can go to Edit, Preferences, Settings, and Angle Snap by default's on at 5 degrees. If I don't want that, I can change it to whatever I want it to be. Maybe it's 10-degree increments, or maybe nothing at all. I'm just going to put it down to 0 so that I have kind of that fine control over how I want to place it within my scene. I'm going to actually put this guy in here. I can see that it needs to be scaled up. It doesn't actually fit our driveway to exactly how I want it. I'm just going to hit F to frame in. And I think we should make that probably a little bit bigger. So I'll just tab over to, actually I'm going to go underneath into the actual iron gate itself there. And just bring that up a little bit bigger. And tab it over to drag it. There we go. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to push it back because I'm going to remove some of these pieces in here. I'm actually just going to select them, quickly delete them so we don't have them in our scene. And we have a couple on this side here. We'll just delete these guys out of the way. That should be fine. And then if we jump down to the bottom, our assets that we bring in are always going to be at the bottom whenever we bring them into our scene. And we'll just place it somewhere around there. Now, this guy actually needs to be pulled up above the ground. There we go. So there we can see that we have our cool little gate placed into the scene. That's courtesy of Turbo Squid. We grabbed that gate off of there and we're able to bring that in. Our X-Frog trees are in our scene here as well. Now let's just quickly bring in a couple of other things here. While we're out here, we have some characters walking around and we grabbed some characters from Access. I'm actually going to put some here just at the front of our scene. I'm going to hit G so we get rid of any of those little manipulators or custom paths that we have in there. And maybe we want to just start bringing some characters into this scene. Now, it's important to know that these are pose characters. If you recall, when we brought these guys in, I'll just drag and drop this guy into my scene. We have a number of them here, of course. So if you remember when we were working with these posed characters, we had 5 variations of them. Well, in this case here, I left them all so that I can kind of pick and choose depending on what my project is. So in this case here, I think I'll keep that guy. So I'm going to go in and remove the rest. So I'm just working just with this guy here. And then what we'll do is we'll actually move him just to be here on the corner. Whoops. And we'll just place him there, something like that. And we have some other characters here we can do the exact same thing with. Placing them in the scene, and if we wanted to dial in a specific character that we wanted to work with, same idea, I'll just keep the middle one. But I'm leaving that library in there so that I have access to those characters at any time. I can switch back and forth. So if I want to populate this with more characters, I can simply go in and grab that library and be able to populate that there as well. So let's move on here. and take a look at some other little tricks that we can do. We're going to move inside the house. We're going to put some furniture in there. But the first thing I want to do here as well is show some tricks to rapidly get into different places. Now, if I want to get into this house, right now I have to maybe hold down the W key and maybe kind of sail around to get into there. And I can do that. Or I can tumble around and maybe find a piece of geometry, for example, this fireplace, and hit F to get within the general location and then kind of zoom in. Another trick that we can do, if we get to an area that we're happy with, we can actually set kind of a camera location, a bit like a bookmark trick. If we go down to our media area here, I've built two into the image, so I can set an image here. If I create image right now, it's going to essentially bookmark that one. I've created one here for the outside, pretty much where we were working. If I click that, I'm now back into that working area. If I quit out of the media mode, I'm out of there and I'm just working away where we were. Now, if I want to get back to that house where I was here, I'll just click onto one of these and we're back inside that house environment really quickly. So that's an excellent little trick to kind of jump around in your scene, save these image kind of bookmarks to be able to work with things. So let's quickly populate this scene in here. You know, we might want to actually replace perhaps one of these chairs. I'm just going to get rid of my transform. Let's see what we have here. So we have in this group, we have this mesh here. I'm just going to actually turn that guy off, and we see that we have some other little framing on this one. We'll turn that off. So we're just hiding those guys away. We'll just collapse those. And back to our user library, we had some furniture. We had a club chair that we brought in. I'm just going to drag and drop this guy into this space and really quickly maybe turn that around so that it fits quickly into the space there. So there we go. We can quickly bring that in. Let's move to the outside into the patio in here as well. We have some other assets that we can work with here. We have some sun lounge or some patio things here, but I want to take a look at a cool trick that we can work with materials. Now, we've looked at objects and assets and how we can bring them in and customize a user library and some tricks in working with those assets. But let's take a look at how we can work with some textures in a different way here as well. So I'm going to go into my trees directory. I'm going to drag and drop this palm into the scene. I'm going to move that up a little bit. And you can see that I have this really cool palm tree here. I'm just going to click on the base of this and come into it. It's really nice. This is from the Axis library, and it looks good, but we have a problem here in Twinmotion. There's nothing wrong with the asset. It's the way Twinmotion's handling the materials on this here. So what I'm going to do is make sure that we're working with those leaves, because right now we're only seeing the bottom side of that. So if I go into Palm FBX, you can see what I've actually selected here is leaf. We have all the different pieces here by stock, because if you remember when we imported that asset, we did that actually by material. We broke that down. So what we want to do with this leaf in here is a trick here to make sure that we're seeing both sides of it. And then we're going to do something really cool with the translucency on this, with the material on it. So I'm going to take the eyedropper. I'm going to go in and I'm going to click somewhere on what I need to work with. So this leaf right now, the problem is we're not seeing the top side. See, we're only seeing that bottom side. So that's a problem. It's a common problem you'll see with things that use transparency maps. So in here, we've got our material by using that eyedropper. I'm going to go into setting, and I'm going to click two-sided on. And there we go. We've solved that problem now. Now, really quickly, I want to do something really interesting on here. I'm actually going to step away from the materials, go to the lights. Let's just grab a simple spotlight. I'm going to hit G so I can see that spotlight here and see the impact that it's having on the scene or how I can work with it. And I'm actually just going to place this right above the leaf here. And what this is going to allow me to do is some really kind of cool things that we can do with materials here in Twinmotion. So I'm going to leave that one there. And the reason why I'm going to leave that one there is we want to look at how we can change these leaves to not be so opaque. And for that matter, something that's translucent. So I'm going to come to the leaves. I'm going to click on that material there. So, whoops, we're using the wrong material. There we go. So right now we're just using a simple, it's actually a flat material with an alpha map. So I'm going to go into the bottom here of our materials, and I'm going to go to translucence. I'm going to use this white styrofoam material. I'm going to drag and drop it onto my leaves. It's going to turn them all white, and we see the alpha map is gone there too. So that does look a little bit weird, but the way we can fix that here is to work with textures. This is how you would import your own textures as well. I'm on white styrofoam is what I've placed on here. I'm going to go to the color mode, and I'm going to click on more. And then once I click on that with the texture, I'm going to open up into here. I'm going to find where my axis palm tree, X-Frog palm tree is, and it's in here. I'm going to go to the textures, which are in here, and I believe the texture we want is this guy. And there we go. We can see that it's actually replacing that, but it's also putting the alpha map in to where we want it. So I'm just going to go back up to the top of this here. And what we can start to do is dial in things like this translucency. So if we watch this material I have has translucency on it. So we can dial in a bit of translucency. It may not look like much there, but if we look at things even like the shadows down below, we can see it'll affect that just slightly a little bit. But the really cool thing is if we bring this around, let's go maybe actually select the base of the pot and come out to here and come up down below. We can look into here and we can see that we're actually getting some of the light coming right through on that palm. So if I grab the intensity of this, we can see that we get this really nice kind of translucency effect through the leaves by taking advantage of Twinmotion's translucency materials. So when you work with assets in Twinmotion and you bring them in, you're not stuck with the materials. You can change them to whatever you want. You can import your own textures to work with those as well. And that's the last thing that I want to show really quickly here. Actually, let's jump quickly to our bookmark in there. Go back to the city scene. And we looked at how we can work with different assets here, different models. I want to change this texture right here. So I'm going to grab the eyedropper, click on that. I'm going to go into this, and what I want to do is actually bring in my own textures to be able to work with that. So I'm going to go into more, and I have some Quixel textures that I have. So I'm going to open. I'm going to go back to my scene. In here, we'll go to Demo Data, Quixel. And I have some stone textures that I want to work with. I'm just going to quickly bring in that albedo map. And what I can do on this is actually scale this, work with the overall scale on this. So I want to put this guy to be actually maybe a little bit smaller, down to something like that. But I want to click on more so that I can rotate this so that it's sitting maybe at around 5 degrees. So it's sitting a little bit more proper on there. Now what we do need to do is go to the settings, and I need to change this bump. So I'm going to go into the texture. I'm going to go to open, and I'm going to bring in that normal map for it. So there, we'll go back to settings, and I'm going to crank up the bump here. If I go right inside here, I can actually crank up that normal map on this. You can see it happening a little bit along the seams. What we want to do is crank up that normal map there. Now we're getting some nice bump happening in there as well. Okay, so that is a quick overview of how we can work with assets. There's much more that we could cover on here, but this is, I think, a good basis for how we can bring external assets into Twinmotion, build a custom library that we can use in other projects as well. So I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar today. And I also want to remind everyone to make sure you download the current free version of Twinmotion right now. There's lots of cool updates to come in a very new version of Twinmotion that'll come out in the future. But in the meantime, grab the current free version while you can. And stay current with lots of cool contests and other things going on social media. Specifically, if you take a look at the Twinmotion page on Facebook, you'll see lots of really cool things and events and contests going on in the Twinmotion world. Thanks again for joining.